Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I just wanted to do this rather short kind of interim mini-zode, as it were, because I asked a question on Twitter a couple of weeks ago, and I was really quite impressed and heartened by the response, because I was really quite interested to see what it is that actually brought people to folklore and what got people interested in it in the first place. Because I think everybody has quite a unique perspective on what it is that constitutes folklore, but also how they actually came to it in the first place. Now, I've certainly talked about some of the ways that I came across folklore, and I usually date it back to when I was around about 10. We'd gone to one of the castles or stately homes in the northeast, of which there are several. And my mother had bought me one of these little pamphlets where it's just like A5, and it was called More Ghosts and Legends of Northumbria, and it was only about £1.80 or so on, and it just basically told some of the legends of Northumbria, and obviously that includes things like the Laidley Worm, it includes things like the ghostly bridal party in Featherstone Hough and so on. Loads and loads of really interesting stories, some of which I've done on the podcast, some of them I haven't yet. And basically, that was what that got me into it, because every time we went somewhere else, my parents would then buy me the next one. So I ended up with the first one in the series, Ghosts and Legends of Northumbria. And I ended up amassing this collection of books of Northumbrian folk tales. We would go elsewhere in the country on holiday. So I've got one from Norfolk, one from Dartmoor, one from York, Edinburgh, so on. I've even got one from the Rhine Valley from when we went to Germany. So pretty much every time I've gone somewhere, I've got one from Venice as well. Every time I've gone somewhere, I've ended up buying a book of folk tales or ghost stories associated with that place. So that was why I wanted to know how other people had gotten into it. So that is indeed what this little episode is going to be about. I'm going to share with you the original tweet, and then I'm going to show you some of the responses as well. So the tweet that began it all was this. So I'm curious, what is it that brought you to an interest in love for folklore? Which legends first drew you in, and what do you love about it? Now, I did get a lot of responses across Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, so I did end up collating them. And then I found that they all split essentially into 6 categories. But those 6 categories all actually dovetail together quite nicely. So the first category was that folklore was shared through the family. As an example, someone said, I just remember always growing up with the stories and being enchanted by them. The idea of our past and how these places still rub against ours, it's captivating. There were other cool answers which were basically along the same lines, and that was things like people grew up in a family that shared the stories, grandparents told them the stories, parents told them stories while they were out and about doing things in their local area, grandparents would pass on superstitions and so on. And then people basically talked about the way that their families just passed on these traditions. Some of the traditions were obviously their own, other ones were fairy tales and folklore and like wider myths and so on as well. So ultimately, people were encountering folklore because it was just part of their family tradition to do so, which I think is really cool. One person actually said, I can't remember ever getting into it. My mum always told me stories from our local area as a tiny kid. So in that case, it was just always part of her family space, as it were. And this one actually fits in really nicely with the second area, which was a way to connect with heritage. And one of the responses was part of it for me was a connection to a part of my heritage. And there was a respondent whose father was Jamaican. So by learning about Jamaican legends, it was a way for her to connect with him. You had people saying how it was a rite of passage in their village to essentially listen to older kids passing on ghost stories and so on. And there was very much this sense of it was part of your heritage to consume these stories and have them passed on to you, which I thought fitted in really in an interesting way with that previous idea about sharing it through family. And again, both of these things dovetail in with the next area, which was the idea of connecting with place. And one respondent said, it's something I actively seek out if I travel somewhere to find out what the local tales are. I feel like you get to know the culture and the people by understanding the folklore. It's fascinating to me. Somebody else also pointed out that it's important to actually connect to the stories in their place, and they really do make the landscape actually come alive for you in a very different way. Other people said that they ended up reading about other places to see if they had similar legends to where they grew up. And another one that I thought was a really interesting one Researching the paranormal oftentimes there's a connections to local legends and lore. And indeed, I found this when I used to do paranormal investigations back in the day, that a lot of the time the idea of haunting was essentially supplemented by the legends and the lore in the area. So you do tend to find that different areas do end up coalescing into this one central amorphous mass that we call folklore. The next area is probably my favourite, and that's a love of reading. And for this one, we had reading about them as a child, Reader's Digest books on folklore and strange stories, The Unexplained magazine, Usborne, Roman and Greek gods, browsing the library. And this one essentially acted like a little bit of a gateway into all of the ways that people got into folklore, because a lot of the responses involved the library, which I was really pleased to hear because I'm a big fan of libraries and I do think that they're really important to how we function as a society, even. And a lot of people did find that they were coming across them because maybe they'd read all the other books. One respondent said that she'd read all the books in her mobile library, and the mobile librarian used to bring her a different folklore book every time she saw it. And I was like, go mobile librarian, that's amazing. We need more people like that. So I did like how many of them referred to people coming across them in books. In some cases, there was one respondent, their family had bought a whole load of books as like a job lot, and they happened to have folklore ones in there, so they ended up reading them. Other people talked about ordering books out of scholastic book catalogues and so on. And the one type of book that does seem to have been most popular, other than the Reader's Digest folklore tome that so many of us have, the other one was actually the Greek gods. And I honestly think that they will be thrilled to bits to think that people were still reading their myths now and passing them on and so on as well. So I thought it was really fun that, like, the gateway drug, as it were, to mythology for many of us was actually the Greek myths. Interestingly, there is also quite a lot of overlap between this and the next section, which was being inspired by popular culture. And one person replied and said that growing up, I saw Ray Harryhausen films and loved Bagpuss and Robin of Sherwood. Other people talked about having seen a lot of folklore in kids' telly in the 1970s. Other people talked about the fact that they'd come into it via folk songs. Somebody else said that they absolutely loved things like Star Wars, which were modelled on older tales. So they essentially started to get to grips with folklore via what was based on it originally. Somebody else said that they were really into King Arthur because they'd seen him on a kids program when they were 7. Other people said that they'd watched Merlin when they were younger and wanted to know more. And there was a few people also said that they'd read a lot of fantasy books as a teenager, and then that further got them interested in fairies and folk tales and things, or indeed even visiting the site as well. So popular culture is often based on folklore in some shape or form, or indeed is an adaptation of a lot of these tales. So it's quite interesting that seeing the adaptations then inspired people to go and seek out the original stories as well. And then finally, this last one is my favorite. I know I've said that about nearly all of them, but I really, really like this one because it was the idea of folklore as a part of life. One respondent said, I think it was always in the background of my life, so there was never an aha moment. And I think that was such a cool thing to realize, that you couldn't pinpoint when your interest in it started because it had always just been there. And one of the respondents said that folklore was the background hum of life, which I think really sums up how I think folklore can and perhaps does underpin communities as a whole. Somebody else replied to say that folklore felt and continues to feel truer to me than the contemporary world. It's home. Other people talked about the fact that they felt that they were more connected to ancestors through folklore, and other people it was the love of magic and the sense that the magic was still real in the universe, and folklore shows us how that is. Other people talked about the fact that these stories contain older truths, so while we may have forgotten the stories, the truths still remain, and so on. So I really like that idea of folklore as being this kind of background tissue and fabric and tapestry and so on, that everything is then lived out alongside. So yeah, what I think is really interesting and what came out of that is the way that all these areas dovetail in together. So there's this sense of people wanting to connect with their family and their heritage through the stories that are passed on. In some cases, it may even be family traditions and so on, because that came out as well, that people pass down traditions that they'd done through within their own family, but then also just stories and legends that their family loved. This, of course, then dovetails into this idea of connecting to place. So people then pass on stories about the places where they grew up and so on as well. And then, of course, we've got this idea of people wanting to get to know the places where they're visiting. And this is certainly one that I can empathise with, the idea of, getting involved with the stories and learning more about where you are and what's basically been there before you. And I think this is really, really important for everybody to bear in mind. But if you are a visitor to a place, it is a nice thing to do to get to know the land and what's happened there before you arrived. And I just think that's a marvellous thing that you can do. And then on top of that, you've also got this idea of people getting into things through a love of reading. Really, really impressed with the number of times libraries were mentioned, and also how many people got into folklore via popular culture, because obviously a lot of the popular culture that people were referencing wouldn't exist without the folklore. So I quite like that back and forth that you've got between things that even like Star Wars, and also things like Tolkien and Merlin and all these kind of things. They wouldn't exist without the original source story. So I like the fact that that's then led people to then go and investigate them as well. And finally, just this idea of folklore as sort of a part of the background hum of life. I think this is indeed one of the reasons why folklore is really important, because of the fact that it is essentially the law of the people. It is something that tends to be generated by a community or a group. It is not owned by any one person or any one group, which I think is really important to bear in mind as well. And I think that there's a sense that we all kind of share in it in some way, shape or form, which is why I think it's so wonderful what Mark Norman's doing over at the Folklore Library and Archive, where he's trying to preserve a lot of this folklore essentially for everyone's benefit, so that we can continue to share these stories and we can continue to pass these traditions on and so on as well. And I think it's absolutely fantastic when you look at how many folklore podcasts that are covering legends and folklore and traditions from so many places. So I think that it is something that there is a definite growth of interest in as well. So I think that that's all really interesting. If you didn't answer the question and you'd like to, then feel free to drop me a comment. I'm on all the social media platforms and all that kind of jazz. And otherwise, just let me know which one of these resonated with you the most, just because I'm nosy. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you soon. Cheerio.